Hello, hello. People at the back, please. People from Balai. Okay, you can, rapat-rapat. This is very santai. Okay, I'm going to be reading this, okay? Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera semua. Selamat datang ke pameran hanya satu single Kenyalang Circus oleh Marcos. Saya Nia Sabjan akan menjadi pengacara kita pada petang ini. Pertama sekali saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih atas kesudian semua untuk menghadiri sesi petang ini. So first and foremost, let me tell you more about Marcos himself. So Marcos Kueh adalah seorang artis tekstil dari Borneo dengan latar belakang profesional, reka bentuk grafik dan periklanan. Marcos juga menamatkan pengajian di Royal Academy of Art di Belanda, Netherlands pada tahun 2022. Jadi banyak karya tekstil beliau adalah penerokaan dan spekulasi mengenai makna tradisional seni craft di dalam konteks contemporary. Amalan kerjanya telah mendorong untuk bekerja dan mempelajari kedua-dua teknik tenunan tradisional di Borneo serta kilang-kilang moden tenunan di Belanda. So a bit about the Kenyalang Circus punya work. This work dia mengetengahkan siri karya tekstil berwarna-warni yang fluorescent dihasilkan dengan mesin tenun industri. Seni tekstil ini diinspirasikan daripada image-image Malaysia dan Borneo yang digabungkan dengan image-image kasar iklan jalanan, logo jenama multinational dan benang fluorescent sebagai sindiran halus terhadap sebahagian masyarakat barat dan semenanjung Malaysia yang sering menyalah tafsir pelbagai budaya Borneo. Jadi Kenyalang Circus will be exhibited from the 1st of December, which last year, until the 31st of March 2025. And now I would like to welcome Marcos himself to take over.
Hello. Hi. My name is Marcos Kueh, and I'm born in Kuching. Currently, I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm a textile artist. My background is in advertising and graphic design. Studied in the Netherlands in 6.5 years ago. And in the last 2 years of my studies, I switched to textile design. So my background is just graphic design and textile design. I started actually my studies in the One Academy here, and then moved to design. So when I was studying in design already, there were a lot of conversations with my head of department. And one day my head of department was asking me, Marcos, what type of graphic designer do you want to be? So naturally I was telling her that I wanted to be someone like Steven Stegmeister. So that's like the equivalent of Andy Warhol in the art world. And my lecturer told me, like, I don't think you can be that. And I asked her why. And she was like, yeah, why do you think that you can be a better American graphic designer than an American graphic designer, right? Everything that Steven Stegmeister does is about New York and New York culture, and you are from Malaysia. If you're in Malaysia, how do you do New York design? And that really made me consider and think about what it means to be a local designer. So a lot of my research when I was a graphic designer was about going to the streets, going through Pasar Seni. And because I come from Sarawak as well, I grew up in a city center where a lot of tourism happens. And so the research naturally just went into craft work. One of the works that I was very drawn into was textile works from the Dayakan tribe, so the Ikat and the Pakumbus. I think there was just something very magical about the storytelling capabilities of these textiles. But when I was a bit younger, I was studying a lot of the textile work from a distance as academic. So I was studying it academically. I think there was still a stereotypical idea of what it means to be a textile weaver, even until now. So if I were to tell my parents that I want to weave, I don't think they would accept me as a son. I think so. Typically, of course, when you think about weavers in Sarawak, you will automatically think about the village and people who might not have the privilege to get educated, or people who might not have the privilege to even come to the city. And there's still this connotation to that. So when it comes down to a boy who lives in a small town in Kuching from Chinese families, there is still something within me that says like, oh, it's safer to actually just do it as academic, because if I'm an academic studying textiles, I can still be, cool and accepted by society. It was not on. It was only until I went to the Netherlands that there was a textile workshop in the school that I started to actually pick up weaving. In the Netherlands as well, there's also the textile museum where they do a lot of industrial weaving for contemporary artists, and that really blew my mind because, of course, one of the things that we are also facing in Sarawak is the slow extinction of the craft as well. Logically, if you think about what I said, as a boy from Sarawak, Kuching, nobody likes to weave and it's not cool. So logically, the craft is just going to diminish. But then when I was in the textile museum in the Netherlands, I realized that, the textile industry is so big and so wide. And there's still so much things that we can still do with this industry itself. It was the first time that I felt like, oh, wow, like it's so cool. It's something that I aspire to be. And there's a certain level of like pride in it. So I told myself, and I was still a graphic design student back then, that I wanted to do something in the textile museum. Somehow, I started from hand weaving in the school in the evenings as a way to get back to kind of remember home. Somehow, when I was weaving, there's a change in mindset. When you're studying textiles as academic, you are just looking at people weave and you're trying to describe, okay, what type of dye they're using very like logical terms for it. But when you're weaving, the headspace switches. You start to see like, oh, the problems that weavers face when they're weaving. You start to consider as well like, oh, there's a lot of sophistication in terms of how you want to calculate things, how you want to control the tension, where it is like, how do you describe tension? How do you describe, all these more sublime things that happens on your hands? And the biggest click, of course, in the head is realizing that, oh, maybe we are not as primitive as we think. And that was a really big starting point for a lot of the more larger discourses that I was exploring back then. I was 23 when I moved to the Netherlands. So that was like 6.5 years ago. And that was the first time that I encountered the word decolonization. And it was really bad because it was through an assignment because I had to go to a report about what it means. Before this, I was trained as a graphic designer in Malaysia, just living my Malaysian life. But when I was reading about concepts of decolonization, I realized that, there was so much things in Malaysia that we never had the chance to, or never had, especially in my studies, when I had to talk about the idea of, or the topic of decolonization, I would always break down and cry. It's very embarrassing. But what I realized that, when we're talking about discourses like this, about decolonization, there's a difference between a white person describing decolonization and a person coming from a colonized land describing decolonization. Because when I need to describe decolonization, I always think about, I see faces, I see situations, and that was kind of like hard for me to process. When I grew up thinking like I will never be enough because I come from Sarawak, and the only way for me to achieve is to actually go to the West. And maybe after I come back from the West, that people would kind of like see me as something more, or like maybe one day the West will accept me so I can also be like rich and influential like them. Was all questions that I was exploring while I was weaving as well, and experimenting with textiles. And slowly, that's how Kenyalang Circus came to be. But even before that, in 2016, I graduated from Dasain, which is Wangsa Maju. And I graduated with the same topic, which is Kenyalang Circus. Kenyalang Circus specifically came from conversations I have with my classmates. I come from Sarawak, so when I go into the classroom back then, I don't know how it is now, people will still ask me, do you live on tree houses? Do you have orangutans in your backyard? And we will always laugh because, of course, it's a humorous joke, but I've always wondered as well, as a country, we share the same country name, why does it feel like I know so much about Malaysia? I mean, Semenanjung, Malaysia, or specifically the capital, Malaysia, and the idea of it. But it seems like there's still so much misunderstanding that happens when it's from the other side to us, right? I'm also considering like questions of like the Sejarah textbook when I was studying in secondary school. We have 3 chapters about the Islamic formation, like about Islam, but we have 1 chapter that we share with Sarawak and Sabah about us in the history textbook. So there's a lot of questions of what does it mean to be Sarawakian in the idea of Malaysia. I just thought like, oh, it could be very interesting if I start to create all these creatures that are formed from the stereotypical ideas of what it means to come from a mysterious jungle, very exotic, and then place it over to KL to start that conversation. Because I thought like, oh, it's very funny, you know. When I moved to Europe, the conversation expanded, right? When they think about Malaysia, they don't specifically think about Sarawak as this mysterious land. They think about Malaysia as this specific land, and you realize there are layers to this type of hierarchies, which I find really interesting as well. And I decided when I was studying in Europe to woven works that you're seeing. I graduated in 2022. Worked in a textile factory and learned how to program weaving so that I can start weaving myself as well. And this was the result from my studies in the Netherlands. It's very interesting because the discourse also expanded when it arrived in Europe. Kenyalang Circus also includes discourses along the lines of also human zoos, for example, like the idea of me being a Sarawakian, understanding that the world sees me as this exotic human, and me trying to perform to that expectation as well. So when tourists come over to Sarawak, you still have this obligation to show them the cultural village because you have to believe that you are still very cultural, but we just go to H&M every single day. We live our life, we drink. We don't wear traditional costumes anymore. At least the friends I know dance in the jungle anymore. But we still have this, if a foreigner comes over, that we have to show what. Or then the questions becomes like, how much of it is formative? In the earlier days, when Europe was still colonizing the world, they had this thing called the human zoos. The idea is that they will make enclosures that look like, for example, the Filipino houses, and they will bring in humans from the colony into the establishment, and they will market it as human zoos, so that it's like a World Trade Fair, so that they can tell the Europeans that the world has many different races. It's their way of trying to say, you know, the world is very diverse. And I thought that was a very interesting case study because in Sarawak, if you're familiar, we still have the Sarawak Culture Village, which uses the same exact concept of having a Melanau house, Iban house, a Chinese house, and then you put people in costumes. And this is what the tourists would go to because that's how you kind of explore what the idea of Sarawak is. So for me, I wanted to do something along those lines of creating giant posters that are woven, trying to sell my exotic identity to the West. And it's a traveling circus. That means that since it has been made in Amsterdam in 2022, it has been traveling to Paris, to Singapore, to also Japan, and at a certain point to New York. And I think that what's very interesting about that is that with every location it goes to, it picks up its own connotations of what it means. Like, what does it mean to be an exotic human being in Paris? What does it mean to be an exotic human being in New York? And finally, after 2 years of trying things out, figuring out the logistics and saving up, the circus has arrived in KL. Initially, I wanted it to be in Kuching first, but logistically, it's just not the easiest thing to do. So right now you're seeing the KL version of Kenyalang Circus. When I was doing preparation work for the show in KL, I think a lot of it is also within my head. It's a bit more conceptual idea of how to approach things. And that's what's very interesting for me when I challenge new spaces. When I talked about the human zoos a bit earlier, they made posters for the human zoos, right? And the posters for the human zoos were meant to be seen by the Western eye. But I've always had questions of what happens if, let's say, the poster was actually accidentally traveled to Philippines and the Filipinos saw the human zoo posters and they become the subject of the posters. And those are topics I kind of want to explore with the show here in KL. What if all this topic, all these questions I'm thinking about gets released and all these weird thoughts I have gets released to the subject matter? What types of conversations will we have? And when I'm doing Kenyalang Circus, of course, it is a critique towards the West and what the West has made of us. But to a certain degree as well, it is also a self-reflection of what we have become as Arakians. Where are we heading? And the ultimate question of who are we are all still part of that thinking process. I call it a process because I don't think that there's a final answer to this. So maybe with that, I can start bringing you guys through some of the works inside the show because it's kind of a walkthrough. Yeah, I'll start with the entrance. With a proper Kenyalang Circus show, a full Kenyalang Circus show, it will always start with an entrance. The idea of the show and the setup and the curation of the show is always trying to emulate like a jungle of advertisements. So when you're going into the space, the idea is that you're bombarded by a lot of details, a lot of text, a lot of colors, and you're traveling through a jungle. There are 9 pieces of work here, and the largest piece is at the back. The largest piece is the only new work that I have done for this show. The rest are all shown before in different locations. The largest one, I think it took 4 days of weaving on the machine, so it's actually quite fast. Yeah, but it is the largest work I've ever done in my career, and I wanted the largest work I've ever done in my career so far to be for the show in KL. In the beginning, you see this series of masks. So there's a series 1, series 2, and the last piece. All my posters are numbered like trading cards or Pokemon cards because I want it to be also like the idea of collectible as well. The first 3 pieces are the mask series, and it's, I think, a bit more self-explanatory, and I think that is a good way to kind of introduce you to the Kenyalang Circus world. Typical diagram mask, the work always pairs with visual and text. So the middle one, for example, there's a diagram mask that says money-minded, primitive performance, or exotic hospitality, and it's talking about the performative aspect of what it means to be from Sarawak as well. And when you're engaging in local culture, how much of it is true, how much of it is a performance, and how much of it is just for us to just get by with a career are all questions that I'm trying to explore. And of course, in the works, there are a lot of details, and all the works from Kenyalang Circus series, if you notice the background, there are also advertisements that is talking about shark loans or prostitution. I've been very inspired by the local prostitution advertising, just because I think that they never use the word prostitution, but they always use like massage as the thing that sells. So you have honey massage or volcano massage or cheesy massage, and I just think that, well, you know, on different levels of society, there's so much that there are still creative ways to kind of market yourself. And I think that that's also a tricky way to kind of also insert that commentary in my work as well. In the forefront, of course, we are trying to sell Sarawak as a culture, but at the back end, we are also just trying to sell ourselves so that we have money lah. If there are more questions later on, you can always just ask. So we can travel in. So it is supposed to look like a small hike through the jungles of advertisements. And the second series was really focused on exotic help or exotic workers. This is poster number 10. And with the humanoid collection, there are always names to it. So as you can notice, of course, you see a figure here. And you can also see that there's a name at the bottom. And the names are all invented scientific names for the creatures. So I make the creatures, I give them scientific names. I just think that it's a very interesting practice. The first book of Kenyalang Circus is actually the Rafisha lady. And it's another long story. But I think that it's very interesting that when we put scientific names to creatures, they suddenly become object of study, like objects of academia as well. So it kind of justifies that, oh, you know, we can observe them from like this because it's academic and scientific. So we can describe people like that. So if you look into history as well, how they are trying to talk about race, how they are trying to talk about diversity early on, it is always through that lens first, because that is the most neutral lens to talk about race. But it is only because the subject matter is not them and the subject matter is always us. So I'm always curious as well what people think when, you know, scientific names are given to the humans lah. At first glance with this work, people in Europe especially ask me if this is a goddess or if this is a monster. And what's very interesting about this work is that the creature, you see an exotic creature first, and then you notice that the creature is actually holding a lot of cleaning objects or cleaning equipment. Because of our social economic status in Southeast Asia, of course, we all know that a lot of people travel around the world. They end up in odd jobs. Sometimes they end up cleaning toilets. If you notice a bit more, and if you can read the Hindi text as well, you'll also get a hint, maybe even in the name as well, that she also is a part-time prostitute. So in the morning she cleans, and in the evening she works as a prostitute. For me, the question is that, you know, if someone works in jobs that we don't associate as high class, can they still be seen as creatures of culture as well? Can we still realize that all these people have a cultural history, they have their own families who believe in certain values back home? Or do we only see them as creatures who are coming over to your land to steal jobs, to force you into, you know, poverty, or they are trying to, like, you know, battle you? So I think it's a very interesting piece in that sense that it's right in the middle. And I just leave it there for people to kind of ponder upon. With most of the works, you can see like the small logos inside, and the logos will also give you suggestions of what my thought process is. So the way that I will always describe my work is that you have a table full of notes, then you can kind of puzzle your own research and stories onto what you want to kind of project, what you kind of want to tell about this piece. So there's that type of openness to it. We can travel to the back, and normally a full Kenyalang Circus show ends with a giant woven billboard. So all these are giant woven posters, and this is the giant woven billboard. The billboard idea always comes from this story that I heard from a friend that says that she's from the Kayan tribe, and she told me that her ancestors believe that, well, her ancestors believe that the deceased ancestors lived in the heaven that is shaped like a dome, and the only way that will travel down to earth is through the waterfalls. So I find that idea very interesting and very romantic as well, that the ancestors are looking up upon us from the top of the waterfalls while we are doing all our things, living our lives in the circus at the bottom. For this work specifically, I was pondering upon like what it means to also, what types of different identities that we can kind of latch ourselves onto. At the bottom, you can still see that the texts are still suggesting of the typical Kenyalang Circus practice about commodification of our identities, how identities are being sold in tourism. But when you slowly travel up, the text kind of move on to the lyrics of the Sarah anthem. And I was very interested in understanding what it means to create an anthem and also form a nation, or like this idea of nation forming, because it's very different from the text that we see every single day. You wake up, the text that you see is buy products as a discount, go to Mid Valley, buy a T-shirt, go to Uniqlo, buy something. And when it comes down to like, text about values or nation forming, it's very foreign for us right now. And let's say the lyric says that we should be brave, what does it even mean to be brave? But if we are reading a text and it says there's a discount, we're very familiar with a discount. So those are like texts that I'm also trying to slowly kind of move into. What type of visuals are we kind of digesting, and what types of texts are we reading every single day, are all things that I'm trying to explore on. So slowly from the bottom, where we all are at the human realm, you look up and the ancestors are looking down on you from the top. It is also a small nod to something that I always wanted to do, also in Europe as well, where when I'm going to anthropological museums and they're looking at objects in anthropological museums, they display always the cultural objects where you have to kind of look down. And I wanted the work to be so big that the only way for you to see the work is to look up. And it's a small nod to kind of like figuring out what it means to look up to your own culture. I think that's a good place to stop. And I'm opening up the floor for questions. It depends on how inspired I am, I think. But normally I would say the average process is 3 months. 3 months. Yeah. But if I'm inspired, for example, then it can go really fast. If I'm not inspired, then yeah, I think with artists, it's always like that. Yeah. It's hard to talk about my favorite work because I think I see them as a whole package and a whole experience. So yeah, it's very hard. I wouldn't say I have one favorite one. Yeah. Yeah. I think in Kenyalang Circus, one of the returning element is a very good observation is the eye, because I think the eye is very significant of who is watching who. For me, it's like, am I watching the white person looking at me? Am I aware that someone's looking at me, or am I trying to say that I know that you're looking at me, and this is what I'm trying to portray? So I think the eye is just very interesting. It's like one of the elements which can communicate that very directly. So a lot of eyes looking at you, and you're also looking at the eye. So it's that type of interaction for me. Yeah. A lot of the actually, if you can read the text in Chinese or sometimes Jawi or English or Hindi, you realize that a lot of it is just filler text, and also the visuals are all filler visuals, where it's just trying to suggest that we are a multicultural country. So if you kind of know how to read it, it becomes a very weird, funny commentary. For example, with the lady there, if you can read Chinese at the bottom, it already explicitly tells you that she's a prostitute in Chinese. But if you don't know Chinese, then that message will be hidden from you. But for the people who cannot read the text, it just serves as a visual cue to tell you that, oh yeah, you know, this person is from the Orient. There's something very weird. Yeah. Yeah. So there's actually a lot of all this small text inside, and it depends on how much layers you can access. I mean, for the European eye, for them, for me, I always tell them like sometimes there's just things that you don't need to know, right? It's our own language that we share with upon each other, and when we know it, it's just like a humorous thing that we share upon each other. Yeah, I think there's something very nice about just being able to have that for ourselves, to keep that for ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. When Kenyalang Circus started in 2022, the logic is like, you know, if I come from such a small country and my problems are so small compared to like all the larger problems in the world, like wars, can I make myself so big and so colorful that they need to notice me, that they cannot look away? If my problems are so hard for them to understand, can I make it entertaining? It is a really weird, perverted way of practicing the Sarawakian hospitality as well. It's always about the being a good host, right? I think a lot of the Kerala circus language is not about telling you what is wrong about the situation, but it is always about first inviting you in because it's like, oh, this very friendly location, very fun place, very colorful. Before we start talking about yeah, more complicated questions. A lot of the work that I do about post-colonial thinking is exactly that. How do you take all these connotations of being very passive, for example? Like, you know, people in the Netherlands will always think that I'm not direct enough, too passive. How do you see it and empower it yourself, right? The Dutch person will not help you figure out how you can be more Sarawaakian. You have to be you have to figure out what it means to be Southeast Asian and then add on to the diversity conversation for them. Just because I'm passive or just because I'm not as direct or just because I need 3 days to think about a subject doesn't mean that there's no sophistication in my hospitality as well. And I think there are many ways for us to reconsider all these layers on what it means to be an independent country, right? Like directness start to reject a lot of our own value systems. And we kind of like, I think it's important as Southeast Asians to do that work of like, what does it mean to be seen as passive or be seen as or too complex or too hard to understand? Can we still have a different way of talking ourselves to see to see ourselves as something that can be valuable for the world, right? Instead of trying to always ourselves into the system of the West. Yeah, and it's really weird because we talk for like an hour ish already, I guess, and you see the conversation goes back to the first conversation I have with my health department of me wanting to be a New York designer and how it has changed over the years. Yeah.
Actually, if you guys have any questions, yes, please. Even people at the back. It is a very chatty.
When you approach making a design, do you look at it more as like a whole, or do you focus in on making symbols in the details, or is it more of a conceptual work altogether?
I think with the series work, so I work in series. So every series, I try to open up a topic first, and then normally do it as a triptych, so 3 pieces. So you can notice that it's three, unless it's a big work. I always see my work as an installation. I always see Kenyalang Circus as an immersive design, in immersive experience because when you're thinking about a circus, one poster is not a circus. You know, when you're getting into a circus, you want like an environment. So I will always find a story that is big enough for me to hold at least 3 pieces, research on a lot of references, and I start with the creatures. And then once I create the creatures, then I surround the creatures with like more logos that make sense to the creatures, I think. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else with questions?
Hi, thank you for really inspiring sharing. I'm really intrigued by the formation of your mythical characters. Can you share a little bit more about how you develop them? Like, you know, does the image come to you as one image, or do you develop over time the mythical characters? The characters, yeah.
Mm, I think it naturally comes out when I'm looking at a lot of references. Yeah. So I'm looking at Southeast Asia, looking, and sometimes like, oh, this image is talking to me about something. Then I would pick that as a reference, or like that image would talk to me about a different connotation. So I think as a person with a graphic design background, you look at and you assess visuals very differently. You think about the connotations, you think about what is trying to express. And then I worked in advertising before, and the advertising is like, how do you sell a car with a watermelon? That's what my teachers were like challenging me, like, how can you sell a car with a watermelon? Or when you're making campaigns how do you sell this but using this element? Yeah. My lecture convinced me that in the world everything is interconnected, so you can definitely sell a car with watermelon. It's very interesting. It's that type of thought process. So a lot of references, figuring out if the image is trying to connotate to something, and then if there's a potential for it to expand into something a bit more complicated. Yeah.
One more question. How do you balance your creative process to be able to just draw, for example? But
I think not every project feels like that to me. Like especially in the beginning, it always feels like a flow, but then kind of like when I commit to this style, for example, then it's like work. It's a lot of hours of work, a lot of hours of like figuring things out as well, mundane things of how do we make sense in the series? How do I make sense of it in an environment, for example? Because of course it doesn't look like a lot, but the scale is so big. There's so much layers to kind of consider. So one of the small element that I forgot to mention, of course, is that from the first glance, you see a lot of all these images, but all these works are all formed by 8 yarns, the smaller works. And as a textile programmer, my job is to arrange the 8 yarns into a dimension of colors. So for example, if you look into this color of the flower, you realize that it's actually formed by patterns. So if you look close enough, you'll see that there are diamond patterns inside. And this one is also like with patterns. And these are also the how do you call this? The small things that has to go into consideration when I'm drawing. Like what patterns goes where. I have 8 colors of yarns. How do I mix it so that I can still get a big diversity of color palettes as well. So when you guys have a chance later on, you guys can look into the details of the colors, and you realize that it's actually all formed by patterns that I also have to design and figure out. Yeah, it's a lot of layers, but I enjoy that because then you get into a lot of like dimensions of what you can say. And that's also why I think that, in our initial conversation about textile making, when you tap into that mindset, you realize that, a lot of all this textile production is very sophisticated as well. I like the word sophisticated. And when you think about like, weavers in the village of Sarawak, they have no references, they have no computers, they have no Pinterest, they have no Google, but they can still build weaving machines that can calculate precisely what they want, and they can form visuals from their dreams. And I think that there's something about yeah, there are definitely levels of misunderstandings of how we see people who are not economically privileged. And I think there's a larger conversation we could definitely have about that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I have another question. God, I forgot the question. One second. Because earlier you talked about like it depends on your how inspired you are about a concept. In executing, what concept have you had the most difficulty in figuring out how to express?
Sorry, thank you.
I think as an artist from Sarawak, trying to be as hospitable as I can, a lot of the process is about managing my emotions. I think you know when you're facing like a very heavy topic, the first thing that you would I don't know how probably different people have different feelings. But for example, when I'm talking about when I'm accessing the context of like decolonization, when I'm looking at images of human zoos, right? Of course you're gonna feel a bit of like heavy emotions, perhaps anger or sadness as well. And I think that takes time to kind of process. I think the process would naturally hit where I want it to go when I can kind of explain it without being angry, I think. So what I'm trying to say is that because I function in Europe most of the time, I'm also trying to figure out what's the best way to kind of present a conversation. What's the best way to kind of like take time to. It's almost like you know, like you have a heavy concept about the universe, and then you have to figure out a way to talk to a child. How do you actually explain what it means to be divorced, for example, to a child? You cannot just shout at the child, you know, like you have to process it, and I think that takes time. Yeah, so the conceptual part that takes a lot of time. I think it is important for us to, I think, in the contemporary time, it is worthwhile to consider how we speak to each other, how what type of conversations or what type of tone we want to have when we're talking about heavy topics. You know, it is very easy also for you to talk about decolonization and then just make enemies everywhere. Just very, very, very easy. Yeah, but then how do you actually still choose your own value system to coexist with people who you think has a history of like abusing your own culture? Then how do you actually access that? I think yeah, it takes time, and that's the most complicated because I'm visually trained. I'm a graphic designer. I can draw. I'm trained technically as a textile artist. I can make textiles. But then how do you actually form a language which is respectable, form a language where you are aware of being kind, aware of being tolerant. Not the easiest thing to do, I think. Yeah. Yeah, when you listen to the work through as well, you realize the word diversity is also very complex. Right? Initially, the idea of diversity is taking humans from colonies and put them into like places where they can be studied because we realize that the world is diverse. Even in current spaces in Europe as well, when you're talking about diversity, there are different levels to what that means, right? When you're off in your office, you have like now there are terms like tokenism or like you know trying to hit that diversity quota and stuff like that. There are still levels to it. Yeah. So yeah, interesting thoughts. Yeah, complicated subjects.
Okay, maybe we can go with the last one. Last question. Anyone? We okay? Okay.
Thank you for the talk, Marcus. I wonder how important is it, let's say if you're not here to talk about your work, how important is it for the audience to understand the context? And how do you make sure that the like what you want to say come across when you're not there to talk about it?
I think that's a very great question because I've been in this career for 2.5 years. And when people assess my work, especially in the beginning, people only see the textiles. people see the technique, people are mind blown by like, what? This is industrial weaving, never seen it before, right? And yeah, and it goes back to this conversation that I had with because I was acquired by them, and then I bumped into him in a gallery one day, and then we started talking, and he was telling me it's a bit off from what you're asking, but I feel like it goes to the same conversation. He was asking me like, how do you feel in the conversation of diversity and inclusion in the Netherlands that you will always, as Asian, be behind your black peers? In the front, because the way that they speak and the way that they perform and talk about the subject is always in the front. And as Asians, somehow you're always at the background, right? And I told him like, they are my peers. We are not in a competition. But as a Malaysian, I feel like I grew up or like practicing the idea of taking turns, right? And I think that it is important for us to consider like sitting with a discourse for years, committing a discourse for years. I started this project in 2016, and it has evolved. It has been 8 years of me working on Kenyalang Circus, slaving for Kenyalang Circus. So it seems like, oh yeah, I'm a new artist, I just popped up. But this conversation has been in my head for 8 years, and I've been working for it for 8 years. And I think it's important. I told Rain Wolves, is the director of Celic. I told Rain that I think it is important to take turns, and I also think that it's important for me to just be consistent in how I appear. Right? If I'm in the museums for 1 month, people might not see the text. We might just see the textiles. 2 months, 3 months, maybe they will start to wonder, and then maybe by the 7th month of like showing everywhere, people will start to take me and my discourse in a more deeper level because they see it so much, they start to wonder. And I think it is okay to take time with that. It's an initial step to bring the word back. It's an initial step to share ideas with you, with the audiences here. If I'm gone, maybe in another 2 years, we can still pick up the conversation and we can just go on. I think it's a very important way of reconsidering what it means to be engaged in the discourse, right? It's a discourse ending just over one art show. You do one art show, we talk about this subject, and then you move on to the next one, and you have to talk about a new subject because that's current. Then this subject is just for the show of that. And I think that is interesting to consider different models of talking about things. Yeah.
Okay, I actually prepared questions for you, but I think everyone have already asked me, asked you more than that, so that's great. I think it's a wrap for this session, and I want to thank everyone. So can we just gather over there for a picture? Let's go. Can I please have everyone over here, if you can see me, for a picture time? Thank you everyone for coming. We at the entrance. So when you guys are leaving, you thank you everyone.